So over the weekend, I attempted to recreate the Pandora radio station list animation in Vue.js, and it turns out that Vue.js just supports that animation right out of the box. So in essence, my experiment didn't do anything except use the built-in functionality. And this got me excited about Vue's animation functionality, and I wanted to try something that I've done in AngularJS, which is to animate an item in from a user's click location. So as you can see, I'm clicking around here, and the new items are transitioning in from where the mouse is. So this is a dynamic, data-driven animation, and you can see it works pretty effectively here. I can just click a bunch of times. We have all of our new items coming in there. And let's take a quick look and see how that works, because it's kind of exciting, I think. So here is our unordered list inside of this transition group here. And you'll see that I have an enter JavaScript hook. But one of the great things about Vue animations that I'm discovering here is that it has both CSS animation hooks as well as JavaScript animation hooks, and these two things are not mutually exclusive. So I can actually use the JavaScript hooks in conjunction with the CSS hooks, and that's exactly what I'm doing here. Ideally, what I want to do is move as much of the animation into the CSS as possible, because I think that that reduces the complexity of the application, and it also helps stave off dependencies like greensock and tweenmax and other things that would add weight to the application and potential complexity. So in this case, I'm using the enter, enter active, and enter 2 to configure as much of the animation as possible. Now in this case, I'm transitioning both the opacity as well as the transform. Now the opacity, you can see that I can define at the enter state of the animation, but the transition or the transformation I can't, because in order to animate in, I need to create a relative translation from the original location of the item, and the item and therefore needs to be injected into the DOM at that point. And I don't have information in the enter CSS about the original location of the item, and in the before enter JavaScript hook I also don't have that information, because the item isn't actually injected into the DOM at that point. So what I use to augment the essentially the before to augment this enter class, I'm going to hook into the enter hook, which is where I'm going to set up the initial position of the item. So here's my enter hook. Here's the element, and at this point it has already been injected into the document object model. It therefore has a bounding client rectangle, which will give us the XY coordinates of the item in its native list position. I then take the click coordinates that I've recorded during my click handler, and I calculate the X and Y coordinates of the translation of the particular element such that it's positioned below the user's cursor. So you can see I'm translating X and translating Y based on the delta X and delta Y that I've calculated here. So again, that's going to keep the item within the list markup, but then render it in a new location below the user's cursor. Now at the same time, I have to cancel the transition, because at this point, if we jump back up to the CSS, the transition here is already being applied because the element's already inserted into the DOM and the active state has been entered. So it already has a duration and a timing function. Now I have to cancel out that duration and timing function at this point, otherwise it will animate over that duration to the initial location, but I want the initial location to be put in place immediately. So I cancel out the transition, and now what I have to do is I have to query for something that forces the browser to repaint. By default, the browser tries to be as optimal as possible by chunking updates to the DOM, because the DOM updates are very expensive and it wants to try and perform as many of those at one time as it can. So after I apply the transform and I cancel out the transition, I have to get the browser to repaint such that these two sets of CSS are actually applied to the element. Now the problem is these are being applied as local element styles, which means that, again, this translate here is overriding anything that's in here. In particular, it's overriding the transition timing and duration and properties. So what that means is that after I force the browser to repaint, I then have to nullify the element local styles such that the browser will pick up the CSS that I've defined in the enter active and enter to classes, and it will now animate from the transformation that I have here at the beginning of the enter hook back to the animations or the transformations that I have defined in the enter to class. So you can see here that there's a little bit of hackery here with the force repaint. Ideally, it would be great to just have a before enter method that gives me some sort of element access after the element has already been injected into the DOM, so I can do things like this. Probably in a lot of cases you don't actually need that, so I'm kind of okay with having to perform this sort of a hoop jumping inside of the enter hook. But anyway, I mean, that's all the code in the application here, and you can see again that this works kind of, I think it's kind of cool. I think it just looks nice actually. And there's something very satisfying about seeing things animate in from where you're clicking. I don't know, I think it's pretty cool. And I think it demonstrates the power of being able to use both CSS animation hooks in conjunction with JavaScript animation hooks at the same time on the same elements during the same transition in Vue.js. And to be honest, this makes me very nostalgic for the class-based, the CSS class-based animations in AngularJS, and I do love the power of Angular 2+, but the animations are quite a bit more complicated, and again, it just makes me a little nostalgic for simpler days.